Racist! Transphobe! Fascist! Greetings, ladies, gentlemen, and others. Jelly Scar 888 here with COVID. Actually, I'm over it. I'm fine. I had it a few weeks ago. But then my laptop went down. Took 5 weeks to get the part, I guess from China. I don't know where the hell else they were waiting for it. Anyways, I'm also ready to completely change my living situation. That's going to be an interesting adventure. Diana and I are looking forward to a completely changed lifestyle, a new place. We're looking at land. And I'll keep you apprised of that, only because it's going to tie into a lot of what I'm doing. So my RV is not quite ready for prime time, but it's getting there as well. And my company, Aurora Bright Bikes, is also moving along. I'll talk more about that in the near future, but there's a link below that will give you an idea of what it's all about. You know how they do that? They go, it's a link below, look down there and what's down there. Anyways, I always thought that was kind of funny. So this discussion number 10 is about a wonderful topic. It's about abortion. First, it's about abortion. The abortion hysteria, more precise. It's about the fetus. It's also about the newest hysteria, transgenderism, and its relationship to Planned Parenthood, the government, and the school system. But in the end, what this discussion is really about, as well as much of what I have to say on this channel in general, it's about eugenics. Eugenics and, quote, useless eaters, unquote. If you've never heard that phrase before, then that's one more something new that you'll learn today. But most importantly, this discussion is ultimately about eugenics and socialism. So before I enter into this wonderful discussion, I need to say a few preliminary remarks. This is what sets the stage for why I am talking about abortion or anything else on this platform to start with. The underlying subject is always the same: globalism and human engineering, globalism and eugenics. Now, I have a life. I don't need to do this. As I've said before, I feel that I have an advantage that most of the people online that I've been following don't have. And that will become more apparent as I move along. It's from my background. And one of the interesting things about my background, as I've said before, it's in the humanities. It's in anthropology, ethnomusicology, and ritual studies. We'll get to that very deeply as I start actually promoting and bringing out my courses online. But the most important thing that I want to put across to anyone listening, even if it's two of you out there in the cyber world, if you don't understand that socialism is human engineering, it's eugenics, and that it is happening in the process right now, and that actually that's what World War II was about, then you can't understand the world around you, the world of the early 21st century that we live in today. Progressive liberalism is an engineering project, and you, the people, are what is being engineered. Progressive liberalism is a eugenics project, and you, or someone you know, are among what they consider to be useless eaters. Because the term progressive liberalism was deliberately invented to cover what it really is. It's global socialism. And socialism is and always has been eugenics. Again, without understanding that, if you are a liberal, you won't understand the conservatives. If you're a conservative, you will not understand the liberals, those that are still actually decent people, as opposed to the commissars. How they've been suckered and in what way. But neither of you will understand what most of your leadership is actually doing, even while they're doing it to you right in front of you. This is the neocons on the so-called conservative side. So I have to always refer back to this fundamental social political reality because everything else flows from there. Global socialism is an engineering project, or by any other name, it is eugenics. And I'll be explaining that term as we move along in this discussion. But the short version is, just so you have a working definition as we move along, eugenics is biological biological engineering. We are in a program, we are right now in the midst of a program and a process that is moving us into biological engineering. And that's the most important aspect of this entire discussion. It's also the most nefarious. Okay, so we begin with Roe versus Wade and the abortion issue. Now, 5 weeks ago when I started this video, in fact, when the laptop broke down, I was in the middle of recording this. So I've already written it. Now, as we know, Roe versus Wade has been overturned, but back then it was when the leak came out. So just for your information, for what it's worth, I am not deeply committed anti or pro-abortion. I'm not an anti or pro-abortion proponent one way or the other. My purpose in commenting on abortion and the overturning of Roe versus Wade by the Supreme Court is to situate abortion within a larger globalist engineering project. So with that understanding, there are, for me, 3 fundamental issues that impact on the abortion debate. The first is the question of the status of the human fetus, the fetus debate. Is it simply an undifferentiated organic growth, or is it a human being? The second is to look into how we arrive at what has to be acknowledged as being an abortion industry. What really is driving the abortion industry, and what is the industry's relationship to women's liberation? The third issue is the historical relationship between abortion and eugenics, what I call the useless eaters debate. And we'll be explaining that phrase, as I said, as we go along. Once we have covered those 3 topics as they relate to abortion, then we will move on to how abortion was never about empowering women, but rather it was a Trojan horse through which to introduce a eugenics program into the government. From there, we will see how transgenderism is continuing that process in an accelerated and amazingly perverse manner. So let's start then. The first issue we have to look at is the fetus. What is it biologically, and what is its legal and moral status? If you believe that the fetus is something like a growth, like a tumor, or like a swollen appendix, then yes, of course, a woman has a right to get rid of it. Even if there's no medical imperative, even if the growth or tumor is benign. It's your body, and if you think you're better off without it, you can get rid of it. But even if the tumor could possibly kill you, you still might elect to keep it, and you have the right to do that too. It's your body. However, if you believe that the fetus is a human being, then killing it becomes a highly problematic moral and legal dilemma, because the fetus then has an inalienable right, according to our Western traditions, as rooted in the American Constitution. The legality of killing the fetus is then a serious problem, but it also becomes immoral to take the life of the fetus, even if it is legal to do so. That's rooted in the Judeo-Christian values of killing of the innocent. Even though the fetus is utterly dependent on the mother, who also has her own inalienable rights, the mother does not have an inalienable right to deprive the fetus of its inalienable rights, unless the life of the fetus puts the life of the mother in jeopardy. Anyways, that's how the moral logic goes. But from the Christian point of view, the fetus has an immortal soul, just as the mother has an immortal soul. And also, the fetus is an innocent. You most definitely cannot snuff out the life of an immortal soul without very serious debate and consequences, especially when it is innocent. At any rate, that is the logic of the anti-abortionists, both secular and Christian. There's the immortal soul aspect, and there's the inalienable rights aspect. Now, the 2 polar ends between abortion and anti-abortion is whether the fetus is a growth within the mother's body or a human being in and of itself. That's always been, throughout the history of the abortion debate, the problem, and it's demonstrated through what we might call the abortion timeline, which is the fetal developmental timeline. We can also call it the conception to birth timeline. The question becomes inevitably not if, but when does the fetus cease to be an appendage or a growth, and when does it achieve human status? Everyone must concede that the transformation does in fact occur, but it's a matter of when does it occur within the conception to birth timeline, not if. Obviously, the transformation from a growth to a human being does in fact occur because every single human being, including you, dear viewer, was at one time a fetus. How can you argue that? Every one of you was a fetus. So in view of that obvious fact, whereas a modest majority of women do in fact define themselves as pro-abortion under the euphemism of pro-choice, their support for abortion declines with each trimester until by the end of the timeline, the remaining pro-abortionists constitute a very small minority. And by the way, in the early stages, there's more men who are pro-abortion than there are women. I mean, it's a small percentage, but it's still kind of indicative, isn't it? So I leave it to you, vehement pro-lifers and vehement pro-choicers, to argue the when question out amongst yourselves. I am simply pointing out the obvious. And while we're there, the issue is abortion and nothing but abortion. So stop with the pro-life and the pro-choice false labels. Those are two ridiculous euphemisms. The vehement pro-choice people are often the same political spectrum, or of the same political spectrum, that demanded the vaccine mandate. No pro-choice when it comes to vaccine, no my body, my choice, bodily autonomy, none of that crap. Many pro-lifers are also pro-capital punishment advocates. Not every life is sacred. There is actually the life of the innocent versus the punishment of the sinful. Call it what it is. So no, the issue is not pro-choice or pro-life. It's about abortion and nothing but abortion. So let's drop the euphemisms. The issue is the fetus. When is the fetus to be considered a human being? And now we arrive at the second issue. Why do we have an abortion industry? What drives that industry? And it is relevant to the final questions we are asking. It is, first of all, an industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry. The rape and incest argument is spurious because we do not have a thriving abortion industry driven by either rape or incest. So we can rule out rape or incest as the driving force behind the multi-billion-dollar abortion industry. Now, I'm not saying that some abortions cannot be justified or are justified by that. I'm simply saying we don't have an abortion industry because of rape or incest. We just don't. It's a very tiny percentage. The same goes for the, quote, reproductive health of the mother, unquote. Unless you stretch the meaning of health to include postpartum inconvenience or postpartum economic difficulties, which is ludicrous because the female body was biologically equipped to become impregnated and carry a fetus to full term. And every human society is designed to encourage and take care of the newborns, the new generation, obviously. And healthy women are designed to carry a pregnancy to term. This is how the human race perpetuates itself. That didn't come as a surprise either to any of you, I hope. We can't confuse a severe medical condition with what is merely an inconvenience. So when women want an abortion, it's because they don't want to give birth. Simple. It has nothing to do with their health. They can give birth. They choose, hence pro-choice, not to. Perfectly healthy women choose not to give birth. So considerations about the health of the mother is also not what is driving the abortion industry. So we can rule out rape and incest, the rape and incest argument. We can rule out the health of the mother argument. But what about genetic defects like Down syndrome or some other genetic defect? Does a genetic defect in the fetus justify abortion, even if we consider the fetus to be a viable human being otherwise? Is this a moral or a pragmatic dilemma? Well, it's an interesting question. It's going to be very relevant later on. But either way, the question of abortion in relation to genetic defects, while it presents an interesting question, it really plays a very small role within the thinking of either pro-abortion or anti-abortion factions. Why? Because so few abortions are performed as a remedy to genetic defects that the question really isn't relevant. The abortion industry is not driven by genetic considerations. At least it's not currently presented in that context. But we will return to that subject. It plays a role, but from another direction. But for the moment, the abortion industry is not driven by rape or incest, some made-up notion of women's reproductive health, nor is it driven by questions of genetic defects. At face value, we must concede that the abortion industry is driven almost exclusively by recreational sex, and to a much smaller degree at this time, the selling of body parts, especially stem cell harvesting. Recreational sex creates a massive demand for abortion services, which in turn generates a massive amount of revenue. And as I pointed out, the secondary driver behind the industry is body parts and stem cell sales, something that has been exposed and confirmed by many different sources. Here's just one example presented by the video channel that originates in England. It's called the Lotus Eaters, Stem Cell Harvesting from Abortions. You can follow that link below in the subscription. I'm not going to dwell on this gruesome business. It's been well documented by many sources, and I can say with confidence that even the most ardent pro-choice advocates are going to find what is in that video very disturbing. But nonetheless, the abortion industry has been driven primarily by the consequences of recreational sex, plain and simple. People want the fun, but without any consequences. And abortion seemed to have provided an easy way out. You can't get around that. If it weren't for recreational sex, we wouldn't have an abortion industry. We might still have the abortion question here and there, but we wouldn't have an industry. And it's the industry that is driving the legal system. It's not the occasional abortion. It's the industry. Why is this important to the abortion question? Because as we're going to see, abortion was presented to the public as an empowering right in the struggle for women's liberation and equality. Yet, as we will also see, none of the early feminists thought this was true at all. But before we look at the timeline that reveals when abortion became linked to the women's rights movement, we have to ask the obvious questions. Has abortion helped to empower women? Has recreational sex empowered women? These are very relevant questions. So let's briefly consider the women's empowerment argument. This is a huge subject. We're going to just touch the basic points because we still have to get on to what this is really about, which is the eugenics. So let's briefly consider the women's empowerment argument. The socio-economic argument is the only substantive argument because the bodily autonomy argument is just an ideological afterthought. Hell, many on the left argue against any kind of stand your ground principle. So much for bodily autonomy. You can't even defend yourself. The only argument with any real substance is the socio-economic argument. Does abortion improve the socio-economic empowerment of women? Well, it is the single mother factor that is a clear statistical marker for poverty among women, or at least economic downturn. I mean, it doesn't necessarily put them in poverty, but it's a severe disadvantage, a severe socioeconomic, mostly economic disadvantage. Nowadays, being an unwed mother has no social ramifications at all. There's no stigmatism to it. But the economic factor is important. So let's say it again. It is the single mother factor that is a clear statistical marker for poverty among women. But notice, getting pregnant and having children is not the problem. It's getting pregnant and having children unmarried. That's the problem. 70% of black girls have children out of wedlock. I mean, it's insane. Evidently, sooner or later, using abortion as a form of birth control becomes so unpalatable that even the young girls choose to have the child. But what is it? Abortion supposed to be fun? Our welfare has been incentivizing unwed pregnancies for decades now, and with obvious results. Again, this is something you can Google, you can check on. People have been pointing this out for a long time. It used to be worse, but it's still pretty bad. But for the early proponents of abortion, abortion was intended to be safe, legal, and rare. Well, it's hardly rare, it's an industry. So who has been empowered by abortion? Mostly, if anyone, middle and upper class white champagne liberal virtue signaling women who rarely have abortions themselves but vehemently encourage the rest of the world to do so. While they virtue signal at ostentatious fundraising cocktail and dinner events for the Democratic Party, NPR, of course, Planned Parenthood, and we'll get to that, and other high-profile events that they can go present themselves at. But who has benefited most from recreational sex? The men, obviously. And the statistics show it. Men are slightly more pro-abortion than women. How many abortionists point that out? How many feminists point that out? It's slightly more men who are pro-abortion than women. So when they talk about women's rights, there's millions of women out there who don't consider this a right at all. They act like they don't exist. People who don't exist unless they politically exist or politically correct, that's an interesting thought right there that we'll be covering, but you really should consider that. You know, you're not black unless you're politically black, as Joe Biden told that man. Anyways, I digress. So have women benefited from recreational sex? I don't know. Have they? It's a good question. There's been a lot of sociological studies done around the issue, and mostly by liberal college teams trying to prove that it has. Yet, even they come away with conclusions that don't really work too well for their cause, for recreational sex or for abortion. The word empowerment doesn't seem to get much traction. But do your own research. Look around at the people you know, at your own life. I mean, what do you think? Has recreational sex and abortion done much for you, if you're a woman, or the women you know? It's a good question, but I think anecdotally, at the very least, you'll probably come to the conclusion it hasn't done anybody any good at all. But the real problem, and that's what I'm trying to draw attention to, the real problem is not getting pregnant, not giving birth. It's getting pregnant, giving birth outside of wedlock. It's unmarried women, unmarried mothers that are a clear marker for poverty. What's driving that? Recreational sex. We have an industry, right? It's not safe, legal, and rare. It's safe, or it's been safe, legal, and rampant. It's an industry. So we have an industry creating unwed mothers. And who are the majority of these unwed mothers? Well, you know how they love to say, marginalized communities, people of color. And I've said many times, what the hell is a person of color? But I digress again. So we have an industry that's actually targeted at, if it's targeted at anybody, people of color. An industry creating unwed mothers. That's the clear marker for poverty. That's the clear marker for disempowerment. But abortion was supposed to empower women. Well, clearly it hasn't done that, right? I mean, again, use your own eyes and ears, your own research. It hasn't done that. Now we arrived at the third of my three issues. But first, I want to summarize the first two. The first was the status of the fetus and the moral question that accompanies that consideration. As the conception to birth timeline advances, support for abortion diminishes. Clearly, there is a moral dilemma behind the question of when, not if, a fetus becomes a human being. The second being the fact that abortion has become an industry driven mainly by recreational sex. Regardless of how you feel about massive, socially acceptable recreational sex, that's what's driving the abortion industry, and little else. Whether or not that is empowering to women is another question altogether. But the clearest marker for poverty among women is not getting pregnant and having children. It's getting pregnant and having children while you're unmarried. Recreational sex definitely has an effect on whether or not people get married, or even if they get married, not just when. But we will also see from the history of the women's movement and the statistics, it doesn't look like abortion has done much for women's liberation either. So the question we might ask is, was abortion ever really about women's liberation and empowerment to start with? It sounds like a crazy question to ask, right? Well, it's not. And that's where we're headed. But now, the third issue is that of eugenics, the useless eaters question, or as the Fabians and other leftist socialists put it, what to do about the reproduction of the, quote, residuum, spelled with two U's, R-E-S-I-D-U-U-M. It's the dregs, the leftovers, the non-productive. Think of Hillary Clinton's deplorables. So with eugenics, we come back around to the earlier question concerning abortion and genetic defects in relation to the status of the fetus. What is the role of society, and more precisely the role of the state, in promoting, through controlled reproduction, those traits that are considered most desirable for a more healthy and productive human race, and as a result, a more productive and healthy human society? What should be done about those humans whose traits are considered less than desirable? Now that's a sticky question, isn't it? So first, the short definition of eugenics is that it is a human engineering project intended to promote the genetically healthy and superior gene strains, while at the same time suppressing and eventually ridding humanity of inferior gene carriers, those humans of whom the eugenicists often refer to as useless eaters or residuum. Human self-directed evolution is how the eugenicists like to put it. So why is eugenics relevant to this discussion? The eugenicist movement has always been a central and powerful component of every socialist movement, whether global communism or national socialism. In other words, from communists to Nazis, eugenics was and continues to be a central component. That's why it's important. However, eugenics is most relevant to the abortion discussion because Planned Parenthood was created by the eugenicist and socialist Margaret Sanger. And Planned Parenthood has always been and still is the single most powerful and adamant advocate for abortion. And it was not just Margaret Sanger who was a eugenicist behind Planned Parenthood. All the people who founded Planned Parenthood were eugenicists. Planned Parenthood was in fact a eugenics project from the beginning. Planned Parenthood was also and continues to be an organization run by socialist political activists. All socialism, all progressive liberalism, as you will see, is and always was a eugenics project. This is the critical insight I am presenting here. We are going to see that feminism, abortion, birth control, eugenics, and socialism, right and left, communist and Nazi, have always been intimately related. But in leftist so-called liberal circles, this relationship has always been strategically hidden from the public. But we must be very clear about something that is so central, it is easy to miss. All socialism is eugenics. All socialism is a human engineering project that requires absolute power to undertake and direct. As I said, you cannot engineer a population by consensus. Impossible. You must have absolute power concentrated into the hands of the fewest possible people, far less than 1%. Social engineering was always the first step up front of every socialist movement, but the biological engineering component was always at the center, slightly occluded by the social front from the beginning. Every single leader we're going to see, including Marx, was a eugenicist. So the biological engineering of humanity was always a central feature within every socialist movement. It's why you get genocide so often, or every time. Eugenics is by definition human engineering, and it always included both the social and the biological components. And furthermore, and this is a real critical point, eugenics has always had a pronounced racist component. We cannot, as we will see, avoid that fact. True of the Nazis, but liberals, true of the communists as well. It is for this reason that many at the time referred to World War II as a eugenics war. The communists had their version of human engineering, the National Socialists or Nazis had their version, the fascists had their version, which is very similar to the Nazis, a slight variation. And the remaining Western powers were determined to stop all three of them. However, as we saw with the Tuskegee Institute scandal, the Western allies were not completely immune from the eugenicist thinking either. Those of you who don't know about the Tuskegee experiments need to do a little research. But it involves the U.S. government sterilizing black men without their knowing it and justifying it under a number of pretenses. So my third concern with abortion that I brought up at the beginning of this discussion, that of abortion and genetics, has always stemmed from the fundamental premise that all socialism is at base a human engineering project, which includes the biological. The biological component is central and always has been. This is not my opinion. This is the stated goal of every socialist thinker, from Karl Marx to Adolf Hitler. Yes, people, Marx himself was always a eugenicist. And yes, he was a racist. You socialist liberals are going to be shocked by the obvious facts that will inevitably stare you right in the face. Here's just a few examples. So we're going to start off with some venerable leftist heroes. Again, you liberals will be shocked. So George Bernard Shaw. Every leftist, every socialist who has any academic background at all knows George Bernard Shaw. If you don't, look him up. Quote, "The only fundamental and possible socialism is the socialization of the selective breeding of man," unquote. You understand what I'm saying? This is not my opinion. Socialism is an engineering program. It's a breeding program, and it always was. Later, he, Bernard Shaw, mused that, quote, "the overthrow of the aristocrat has created the necessity for the Superman," unquote. Now, this is Nietzsche's Overman. It doesn't really mean Superman as we think of it, flying through the air and all that. It means Overman means a new human, a new human. Now, this entire paragraph is a quote. "The revered pacifist, disarmer, and philosophical titan, Bertrand Russell." This is a huge person in the leftist canon. If you don't know him, you probably do, but if you don't, you look him up and you'll see what I mean. So, say it again, the revered pacifist, disarmer, and philosophical titan, Bertrand Russell, dreamed up a wheeze that would have made even Nazi Germany's eugenicists blush. Now, keep in mind, Bertrand was the communist socialist stripe. He suggested state-issued color-coded procreation tickets. Procreation tickets. Those who dared breed with holders of a different colored ticket would face a heavy fine. That way, the high-caliber gene pool of the elite would not be muddied by any proletariat or worse, foreign muck. People, you don't want to believe that your socialist idols thought this way. But it's because you have no clue what was going on prior to World War II. That's why. You've been listening to people from the 60s. And believe me, they don't talk about this. The Labour Party, that's the party of progressive liberalism in England. Cabinet Minister Douglas Jay felt no embarrassment in putting the attitude on record in his pamphlet, The Socialist Cause. Famously and loftily, he declared, quote, "In the case of nutrition and health, just as in the case of education, the gentleman in Whitehall really does know better what is good for people than the people know themselves," unquote. Power to the people, right? Does this remind you of a certain Canadian clown nowadays? In the case of nutrition and health, blah, 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 the gentleman in Whitehall really does know better what is good for the people than the people know themselves. This is completely in contradiction, as far as we're concerned, with the American concept of the individual and the fact that the people can determine their own good. The socialists are stating plainly into your face that no, people, you the people, you are not capable of determining your own good. We will determine it for you. And yet you liberals still don't get it. The elitists, the fascists, socialism is always manifested as fascism, including joining hands with capitalism, as we're going to see. As well, I've already showed it before, but it'll be a continuing theme. Non-Britons came even lower on the Darwinian pecking order. In those times, it was the Jews who were regarded as posing the chief threat of alien dilution of English blood. Bernard Shaw described the Jew as, quote, "the real enemy, the invader from the east, the ruffian, the oriental parasite," unquote. Bernard Shaw. The materials I've been quoting from, this is The Guardian. The Guardian. That's the leftist paper in England. It's from the Eugenics, Founding Fathers, British Socialism Archive, 1997. Thus the leading Fabian, that's another high society socialist intellectual group. Sidney Webb. Now, the Fabians are really famous among socialist circles. If you don't know who the Fabians are, you really should look that up. And I compare the Fabians, not really compare them, but I see two groups of the worst of the socialist thinkers. It's the Fabians on one side and what I call the cabal on the other. And I'll go into that later. Thus, the leading Fabian, Sidney Webb, wrote in The Difficulties of Individualism, this is 1896, about the, quote, breeding of degenerate hordes of a demoralized residuum, unfit for social life. That underclass would have many more children than those with superior hereditary material, such as skilled laborers and the middle class. Failure to intervene eugenically, either positively by encouraging the better citizenry to have more children, or negatively making it more difficult for the inferior citizenry to procreate, of course one way is to kill them, would lead societies to commit race suicide owing to the, quote, rapid multiplication of the unfit, unquote. As it was put in the title of a book by the U.S. radical feminist Victoria Woodhull, which appeared in 1891. That book was called Marriage of the Unfit. Now, Victoria Woodhull is somebody we're going to discuss a little bit later on, but she is really an interesting person. So Webbs argued that it was the duty of the state to take the lead in this matter. Now, keep in mind that all of these people were not just eugenicists. They were all socialists. They were, in fact, Marxists. If you don't believe me, well, here's some choice Marxist moments from Marx himself. Again, the same source. This is The Guardian. This is a leftist paper. Marx didn't think much of Mexicans. When the United States annexed California after the Mexican War, Marx sarcastically asked, quote, "Is it a misfortune that magnificent California was seized from the lazy Mexicans who did not know what to do with it?" Unquote. Engels shared Marx's contempt for Mexicans, explaining, quote, "In America, we have witnessed the conquest of Mexico and have rejoiced at it. It is to the interest of its own development that Mexico will be placed under the tutelage of the United States," unquote. People, these are statists, first of all. This is Marx and Engels I'm talking about. You still think this is power to the people? Come on. If you continue this, ignorance after a while just becomes stupid. Notice how false consciousness and how low intelligence are equated by Marx himself. They are not talking about otherwise smart people being lured by false narratives and misinformation into false consciousness. They're referring to people who are, in their estimation, inferior, unfit, maybe even deplorables. Marx had a racial vision that might be interesting to his modern-day black supporters. In a letter to Engels in reference to his socialist political competitor, Ferdinand Lassalle, Marx wrote, Ferdinand Lassalle was a Frenchman, but he had some black ancestry. "It is now completely clear to me that he, as is proved by his cranial formation and his hair, descends from the Negroes who had joined Moses' exodus from Egypt, assuming that his mother or grandmother on the paternal side had not interbred with and he uses the N-word." And he goes on, "Now this union of Judaism and Germanism with a basic Negro substance must produce a peculiar product." Engels, as we've already noted, fully shared Marx's racial philosophy. Remember, this is not just Engels, the German. This is Marx, the Jewish German. In 1887, Paul Lafargue, who was Marx's son-in-law, was a candidate for a council seat in a Paris district that contained a zoo. Engels claimed that Lafargue had 1/8 to 1/12 the N-word blood. In a letter to Lafargue's wife, Engels wrote, "Being in his quality as I'm guessing, he didn't use Negro, a degree nearer to the rest of the animal kingdom than the rest of us." Oh, that's why the zoo, right? "He is undoubtedly the most appropriate representative of that district." Ooh. So the district has a zoo in it. So he's saying, yeah, by all means, this guy could represent that district very well. Still believe that Marxism is about power to the people? Which people? But wait, there's more. Again, you can look this up, but there's more. And also, the relationship between eugenics, racism, and socialism is not merely a relic of early socialism. Eugenics was at the center of World War II on all sides, Nazis and communists. But it was also continued post-World War II into the 70s, under the term progressive liberalism. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, and the rest of you, progressive liberalism. So let's look at Eugenics, the skeleton that rattles loudest in the leftist closet. This is by Jonathan Friedland, again, from The Guardian, no less. 15th of February, 2012. Okay, this story is about Sweden. Remember, be like Sweden? Between World War II and the mid-1970s. Branded low-class or mentally slow, they were rounded up behind secure fences in institutes for misled and morally neglected children, where they were eventually let off for, quote, treatment, unquote. One man has told how he and his fellow teenage boys plan to run away rather than undergo the dreaded, quote, cut in the crotch, quote. Again, these are Swedish children. This is before the invasion. This is before the mass immigration. The cut in the crotch. I'm sure you get it, right? You know what that means. Each day, victims of forced sterilization, now deep in middle age, have stepped forward to tell how they were ordered to have, quote, the chop, unquote, to prevent them having children deemed as racially defective as themselves. A government minister has admitted that, quote, what went on is barbaric and a national disgrace, unquote. They didn't think so at the time. With more than 60,000 Swedish women sterilized from 1935 until as late as 1976. What has shocked most observers is that all this was committed not by some vile fascist regime, but by a string of welfare-minded social democrat governments. Social Democrats are socialists, people. Come on. I've told you the difference between communism, fascism, and Nazism is not worth mentioning. Welfare-minded social democratic governments. Indeed, the few voices of opposition came from the Swedish conservatives. Look how this is so against the American principle, that the people are capable of formulating a vision of their own destiny and the right and ability to pursue it. This is completely the opposite. So let's read that again. What has shocked most observers is that all this was committed not by some vile fascist regime, but by a string of welfare-minded social democrat governments. That's just another name for a fascist socialist government. Is this person stupid? Oh, it's The Guardian, of course. Indeed, the few voices of opposition came from Swedish conservatives. As I've told you, you won't understand conservatism if you don't understand the relationship between progressive liberalism and eugenics, and you won't be able to understand clearly what our liberal leadership is actually doing behind the smokescreen of things like, quote, power to the people and equity and the marginalized. The marginalized, right? This is funny, sort of. So stop confusing us, the libertarians, constitutionalists, conservatives, with your side of the political spectrum, Mr. and Mrs. Liberal, and the other liberals. The fascists, those are your people, and you should have noted by now that your party, the Democratic Party of the United States, acts more fascist every day. But there's more. The gas chambers, people. Gas chambers were designed as a humane method of getting rid of stray dogs in the U.S. They were called lethal chambers. The English expanded the idea in order to get rid of the mentally deficient, the non-productive, the imbeciles, the, quote, useless eaters, unquote. So you know who this is, right? The Nazis got the idea from them. That's right, the Nazis got the idea from the Marxists, the socialists in England. Born in Brooklyn, Massachusetts, Theodore Lothrop Stoddard was a Harvard graduate. He was a member of the American Eugenics Society, a founding member, along with Margaret Sanger, of the American Birth Control League, and, wait for this, people, a Klansman. That's right, a Klansman. Him and his buddy Margaret Sanger. In 1920, he published his seminal book, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, in which he developed his theory of white superiority and the need to improve the population through selective breeding. The Rockefeller Foundation funded various German eugenics programs, including the work done at the laboratory of Ottmar von Verschuer, the geneticist of Dutch descent, who was an advocate of compulsory sterilization programs under the banner of, quote, racial hygiene, unquote. Now, you know how we've used that, right? The reminiscent of reproductive health that they're bringing to us now. Racial hygiene, reproductive health. One of his students was Joseph Mengele, the war criminal who would be employed at Auschwitz to direct scientific experiments on prisoners. But it hasn't ended there in Sweden or throughout Western Europe at all. Who will be engineered or eliminated? How and why? Where does the socialist engineering project stand today? You think it's just left? You think it's just gone away? The project has not been abandoned. Far from it. It has merely changed directions. Who do you think is behind mass immigration today? That's another subject that we will most definitely deal with in an upcoming discussion. But at face value, it sounds contradictory, doesn't it? No, it actually isn't. For now, we'll stick to abortion and eugenics. Again, the socialist project is not and never was limited to social engineering, but was in fact, from the very beginning of socialism, always a project that included a biological component. And this biological engineering component was always central to all socialist aims. Re-engineering the social structures, and with that, all previous human social relations, the family, and with that, all biological relations that inevitably lead to the creation of social relations, and finally, the human body. It's actually in reverse. It starts with the human body. The human being itself, including its own consciousness. It's the re-engineering of humanity. Stalin, Mao, Hitler. All three were avid eugenicists and openly advocated and implemented human biological engineering. We must emphasize that Planned Parenthood was and is a eugenics operation and a socialist operation. Neither, as we'll see, is a secret. It's out in plain sight. But you have a college degree, so you probably don't know this. It is from this nexus that a socialism and biological engineering, which today is hidden behind the term progressive liberalism, that the artificially created hysteria around abortion promotion can be understood. Because it is only from the progressive socialist left that the vehement pro-abortion argument originated from, and from which the argument continues to be stridently promoted to this day. These three items, abortion, progressive liberalism, and socialism, along with eugenics, the fourth element, cannot be separated. So abortion, socialism, and eugenics cannot be separated, which is to say socialism and eugenics. And furthermore, socialism and complete government control can also not be separated. That relationship is fundamental to all socialism, whether communists or Nazis. You simply cannot socially and biologically re-engineer humanity by any kind of consensus. That's impossible. And Marx and all the early socialists knew this. They had complete contempt for the common man. Absolute state power would have to be achieved in order to carry out any kind of massive engineering project, as envisioned by all the socialists. A eugenics program has always been an essential component within any socialist government. In fact, you can say that socialism is eugenics. A eugenics program could never be instituted except through a totalitarian socialist government. And the purpose of a socialist government is, in fact, the re-engineering of humanity. That's what it was conceived to do from the very beginning. And we're talking about Marx and the rest. Abortion here in the U.S. was, until just recently, government sanctioned and government subsidized. Are you starting to see it? It will become clearer. We need to look at how and why abortion became a government subsidized program. Are you starting to get the picture? We need to look at how and why abortion became a government program. That's the critical nexus. And where it's going from here, because the government is not through with eugenics. It's just begun. And this is simply the Roe versus Wade setback is nothing more than that. It's a small setback. The machinery is in motion, and we're going to look at that. So that brings us to the conclusion of part 1 of this discussion series number 10. Abortion, the fetus, useless eaters, and transgenderism. Part 2, we're going to look at how all of the early feminists were completely against abortion. This includes Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. She was vehemently against abortion. She wanted nothing to do with it. It also includes that lady, Victoria Woodhull, who I mentioned earlier, who was extremely radical, but still was vehemently against abortion. So we have to then look into why was abortion imported into women's liberation? For what purpose? And then we're going to look at the new hysteria, transgenderism. And then transgenderism will start to make sense, especially as you see it now with government backing and in infiltrating into, you guessed it, the education system. And who is behind it? One of the major institutions? Planned Parenthood. Anyway, stay tuned for discussion number 10B of abortion, the fetus, useless eaters, and transgenderism.